I'm going to be quickly and introduce Chris Nowinski, who is a great friend, a leader. There is life after football, as many of you will know. That happens to include wrestling. But even more important than wrestling, you can go on to get yourself a Ph.D. in behavioural neuroscience if you work really hard. The other thing, and perhaps the line that I best to describe Chris is a plaudit he's been given in the US, which is one of those people who make healthcare better. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, I have sound on some videos, so just know that's coming. I rewrote my entire presentation today. So thank you for being here. First of all, I want to congratulate everybody who's been involved with the Australian Sports Brain Break and Dr. Buckland. I'm thrilled by what you guys have accomplished here in just over a year and a half. So a round of applause for everyone here. And I'll open with helping you understand why I care so much about this and why I care so much that these former athletes are here who've pledged their brain and these families have donated. This is very personal to me. And so I'll start by talking a little bit about my relevant background. So my day-to-day job is running the Concussion Legacy Foundation. We're a relatively small nonprofit in Boston, a team of 12. And it was started out of my personal experience. I co-founded the Boston University CT Center and our brain bank, which we'll talk about. As Dr. Cohen mentioned, I did go back to school and get a Ph.D. about 2.5 years ago. I really come at this, though, as an advocate, and you'll hear that in what I talk about, but I went back to school to make sure what I was saying was right. And what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of my story, the state of the science on CTE, responsible reporting on CTE, and then living with possible CTE, because there's a lot of folks here, like me, who think I may have this, know they may have this, know friends who've had this. And it's an interesting thing to have in the back of your mind. So my story begins that I was an American football player. So I was an all-Ivy defensive tackle at Harvard University. Then, like most Harvard graduates, I became a professional wrestler. That was me. Cover up more of the picture each year. I'm only going to give you one tease of video, but this is sort of where things started going south for me. This is the Royal Rumble in 2003. You will see that this is not the way things are supposed to go. So wrestling is supposed to be a performance, but sometimes they land on your head. And it was concussion, and I did my career back in 2003. The person who really got me interested in this as a field is Dr. Robert Cantu, who's our medical director now. But back then, he was just the 8th doctor I saw trying to make my headaches go away and help me get back to work. And he was the first person to help me realize there was more to this concussion story than I realized. They did it by just asking me, how many concussions have you had before this? And I did 8 years of soccer, 8 years of football, 3 years of wrestling. But my answer was, I've never had a concussion. Maybe this one was a concussion. And he goes, well, maybe you've had concussions by a different name. You ever been hit in the head and you saw stars, or you were confused or forgot where you are, or you were dizzy, or you had ringing in your ears? And I started laughing, and I'm like, well, yeah, that happens all the time. That's normal. And he goes, no, that's those are concussions by another name. You might have called them a ding, you might have called them a bell ringer, but those add up too. And it was very easy for me to immediately remember that I had at least a few in wrestling, at least a few in football. I know those 6, I know the 6 people who concussed me. This is my enemies list. I remind them every time I see them. They buy the beers. But what changed my life was he helped me learn 3 things that I think it was important for other people to know. One is I didn't know the definition of a concussion, despite the fact that I was a college graduate who had been involved in sports my entire life. And I realized in talking to other athletes back in 2003, no one did. Right? We just didn't talk about them. We called them dings. We didn't tell the doctor about them. We never came out of the game. I didn't understand how much important rest was for getting better from a concussion. And so that was something I decided it was worth sharing with other athletes so they didn't end up like me with these chronic headaches that still last to this day. And then there was this idea of unknown consequences and long-term effects. And that was very intriguing to me because we never know what the future holds. And so I combined that information. I started going to the Harvard Medical School library. I realized that all that information was actually already in the medical literature. And so with Dr. Cantu's encouragement and support, I decided to write a book trying to use my modest platform as a pro wrestler to say, hey, we have a concussion problem. It's fixable. so let's try to change the game. And I focused on football because that's where I had my experience. But what changed for me and why I'm going to start to transition from talking about concussions to CTE is that entire book's dedicated to concussions and my post-concussion syndrome experience, but for a chapter on CTE, because I just happened to get hurt at the right time when the first two National Football League players had been diagnosed with CTE in 2005 and 2006 in case reports in the medical journal Neurosurgery, which I'm sure everyone gets. And actually, no one knew about these cases because they were buried in a medical journal, and there had never been a national news article about them. But I thought, gosh, if the first two NFL players ever studied had this disease that we only thought was in boxers, and like Peter said, your brain doesn't know what's hitting it, whether it's a boxing glove or a football player. Of course, to me, it made sense that that could be a real thing. But those two cases were acquired through the medical examiner system. The doctor who studied them, Malu, got access because he was the medical examiner on their cases. They died in the same city. And I thought, if we're going to get answers for this, we have to actually find a new way to get more brains. And so I slowly started learning and understanding the brain-banking system and realized that you'd have to get family permission to get brains. And that started with a story of Andre Waters. Andre Waters was a famous NFL player, 44 years old, he took his life. And when he died, there was a short article in the newspaper, and they happened to mention his nickname was Dirty Waters, because he liked to lead with his helmet and spear people. And I thought, well, let's look up his concussion history. And lo and behold, there was an article in the 1990s where he talked about concussions, and back then there weren't many articles about them. He said, I think I lost count at 15, I just grabbed smelling salts and keep playing. So I thought, oh, maybe, I wonder if he had CT, I wonder if that had something to do with the depression or whatever he was feeling that led to his suicide. And so she called the medical examiner, and I said, hey, are you going to study this guy for CTE? And he told me that he wasn't, because that wasn't his job. His job was to determine cause of death, and very clearly a bullet had done that. And over a series of phone calls, because back then I wasn't so sure I was right, I wanted to try to convince him that he should study it. And so I started studying him articles and say, no, you should study this, it's in the literature. And he finally said, look, I'm not going to study it, but if you can find somebody else who will, I will release the brain, because despite the fact that I knew the funeral had already happened, and I thought this was a lost cause, he'd actually kept part of the brain for analysis. So I called Dr. Malu. We studied the brain. He said, yes. I said, great. Here, apparently we have to get his mother's permission. Here's his mother's phone number. She was 88 years old. And he said, no, I'm not going to call her, because he wasn't comfortable making that call. And so I decided I had to make that call. And so I did, and luckily the Waters family was amazing, and they wanted to have the brain studied, and so we did it. And if they had not been so gracious, I would not probably have continued this work. But I owe a lot to them. So when we found out he had CT, he was a third of 3 NFL players studied, and the deal I made with the doctor was, I'm not going to wait for this to be published in a medical journal article. People need to know. We're going to put this in the lay press. And so I actually took that information down to the New York Times. I basically knew a guy who got me in front of the editors and I said, look, we've got a problem here, and you guys need to talk about it. And it's chronicled in the documentary. The sports editor said, look, we're the New York Times. How have we never heard of this? And I said, that's a great question. None of us have, but it's real. And they agreed, and it became a front page article, and it started this national conversation around what's happening in football and what's happening in sports. When that became positive and another case became positive, that's actually when I said, all right, we have to start a nonprofit and keep this going. Back then I was just doing this as a side project while I had a real job. And so we incorporated in June 23rd in 2007, and interestingly, within 10 days it became very personal. 10 days later, a colleague of mine from WWE, Chris Benoit, didn't show up to a wrestling show. They went to his house and found he'd killed his wife and child, and then hung himself. And what haunted me about that was, at first I'd known him as a great guy to me. You never would think this guy's going to do that. But he had, when I was writing my book, he'd actually pulled me aside at a show and started asking me what I was learning. And said, he asked me how many concussions I had. I told him, 6. So, and he said, I asked him how many he had, and he said, more than I can count. And he asked me if I would give him a call that next week. And I had never had his phone number. He was a big star. I wasn't. I gave him that call the next week. He answered. He actually sounded agitated, like he was in the middle of an argument. He said, I'll call you back. He never called me back. I never had the guts to call him back. And this is what happened months later. And I realized he was probably going to ask me for help, but he just didn't. And so I talked to other people, realized that he had exhibited all sorts of bizarre behaviors in the previous 2 years, depression, was no longer planning matches because he couldn't remember them, so he would just call them in the ring. And so I talked to his father, and we actually had his brain studied, and of course, he had CT as well. And so this is what sort of led, it sort of put a little wind in our sails here, because I realized it wasn't just about, people hurting themselves, that now this has been repeated multiple times. I think disease is changing people to the point where these things can happen. And so I've spent the last 10 years, 15 years now almost, asking people for their brain. I have a nice TED Talk if you want to watch it, but basically I don't leave a room unless I ask people for their brain. So I'll tell you right now, I'm expecting all of you to sign up to pledge your brain before you leave. I don't care if you're a control, we need those as well, but we need answers. And you can understand why I care about this. But what I did was, when we started Foundation, we said, let's find scientists who will help us figure this out. And so the deal I made with Dr. Ann McKee at Boston University was, I said, look, if I can get you brains, will you please study them? I don't have any money to give you. I don't know how you're going to do it. I don't understand what you're doing, but I can get you the brains, and you need to help us get answers. And she said yes, and she's been an amazing partner. I made the same deal with Michael. I don't have any money, but if I help you get some brains, and he's been the same way. Neuropathologists are special folks. So, and Ann McKee also works for her main employer is our federal government, our Veterans Administration, our Department of Veterans Affairs. So her primary work is actually military. So she's been great, and we've actually had 800 brains donated since we partnered in 2008. So it's been quite extraordinary. Nearly 500 of them have had CTE, and that's of the ones we finished. So what's been amazing to us, and something for all to think about, is that we don't have a way to diagnose this in living people, but families have been right 2/3 of the time in diagnosing their own loved one. And in our football community, it's been about 85% of the time. So there's something that people are picking up about this disease. And we just have to find a way to codify it so that doctors can do that as well. Because it's also important not to be wrong. But we're really skewed to football players, although we've had a lot of other exposures. This is how we've grown over the years. It does take a while to get going. As you can see, in our first year, we only had 6 cases. So, in 18 months, you're basically on pace of beating us. So good luck with the next 791. But it helps us learn a lot. 72% of our brains are American football players. That tells us that we probably have a huge problem in American football. But we also have military, ice hockey, boxing, rugby, soccer, amateur wrestling, mixed martial arts, pro wrestlers, lacrosse players, baseball players, and then all these interesting exposures that come in extreme sports, basketball. We're learning about all of these exposures. A lot of these are taken as controls, like tennis players. Not many other swimmers. There's a couple swimmers in there that we'll take to try to get that high-profile athlete, but didn't have exposure. What really helped change the conversation in the States was that, I told you I got involved when there were 2 NFL players, that we found 4 out of 4 NFL players. We published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association when we had 111 NFL brains, and 110 of them came back positive. That happened to be 10% of the people who had played in the NFL who had died during the 8 years we were collecting those brains. So at a minimum of 10% of NFL players have this. And as you can see from that curve of how many more brains we're getting now, we're basically still shooting over 90% in that group. So it's probably not a minimum of 10%, it's probably a minimum of at least 20%, maybe higher, which is very concerning if you've stepped on that field. But the value, and what we've accomplished, I'll share with you the research findings that we've had over those 11 years, but there's so much research, we could be here for 8 hours. So we've published nearly 100 articles on the work. But I'm going to talk about it through making it relevant to the discussion that you're having here right now, because I think there's some things you can learn, and I think I'd like to influence and accelerate the conversation you're having about what's happening here. But what's been great about this is we can't yet treat this disease. We do know enough about this to take it seriously. And it's even led to the NFL, who had documentaries made about them in 2013 called League of Denial, because they were saying this wasn't real, and there were congressional hearings where they were saying, this hasn't been proven. There's no cause and effect. In 2016, as the cases added up, they actually at a congressional hearing for the first time. Let's make sure the sound works on this. We don't have the sound. Is there something I can plug in or do it again? Thank you. So that was Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, whose grandson was playing football, so she wanted an answer, and she basically pushed out of them that they finally agreed that this is real, and they haven't walked that back. Their new chief medical officer has been very supportive, saying this is a real thing. There's a lot more to need to learn, but this is real. And I show that to you because of the timing of me coming out here is interesting, as there's been a new rugby league study announced. And so I want to talk about that, because there have been, I think it's great to have, I welcome more research on this issue. I think it's great that the funding is going to go to Dr. Claire Shepard, who's another neuropathologist, because, basically my job is to recruit neuropathologists. And recruited Dr. Buckland, they recruited Dr. Shepard. That's great. The more brains we have studying these brains, the better off we are. But along with the news of this study have been some statements I wouldn't agree with. And so I want to talk about them, because I don't think we have to wait. This was one of the quotes that was interesting to me. The PI, Dr. Andrew Gardner at Newcastle, said, what we need to do is, he said, he doesn't believe in cause and effect, and that the studies we're doing now won't prove that. And he said the ideal study, what we need to do is conduct a study where we're looking at children who are playing contact sports who've never had a concussion before. Then we'll characterize their concussion and follow them throughout the entire lifetime, especially when it happens on multiple occasions. Then we'll have them donate their brains to science. We have a better understanding of the full spectrum. But it's a study that'll take multiple researchers and multiple generations, so we won't have a cause and effect answers for 1.5 to 2 generations for players coming through. And I will say I disagree with that statement. And I will share with you why I disagree with that statement. And I would argue that today we actually have enough knowledge to say cause and effect has been proven to an extremely high level of evidence. And that level of evidence is the Bradford-Hill criteria for causation. This is the most widely cited epidemiologic criteria for causation. It was in 1965, Sir Austin Bradford Hill put it together at a conference on occupational exposures, which is really what this is in many ways. And he said there's 9 categories that we need to consider. We want to understand, should we assess that there's cause and effect here? So I'm going to walk through and show you the evidence in most of these categories. It starts with strength. The larger the association, the more likely it's causal. That was talked about a bit by Dr. Buckland with the large-scale studies of NFL players and Scottish soccer players. So I'll skip that one and jump ahead to consistency. So one of the questions is, are we getting the same answers out of many labs? And so what's been great about building these global collaborations is that, yes, Dr. Buckland has proven, thanks to the folks in this room, that we're getting the same results here. Our football players are getting it. Your football players are getting it. Right? It looks like the same disease no matter what country they're in. The next level is specificity. All right? Causation is likely if there's a very specific population without other explanations. The more specific, the more likely causal. So an interesting study to help us appreciate that was done by the Mayo Clinic a few years back. So the Mayo Clinic, in recognizing when we first put together those CT criteria that were published in 2015, Kevin Biniak, who, God bless him from doing this, went back and looked at 4,700 cases they'd collected over the last 1,800 years. And his first job was to look through records to figure out, can he identify who were the contact sport athletes? And so he actually was going back and reading yearbooks and reading obituaries, and he was able to identify a group of them. And what he found, and this is a little bit of it's a good schematic, but we just need to look at the bottom. He basically took out people who had diseases that might be hard to differentiate, although we're getting better at it. And he just found this group of, he looked at male controls and female controls, 198 of them, who did not play contact sports. You know how many had CTE? 0. He also found 66 contact sport athletes. You know how many had CTE? 21. Right? So that's an extraordinary study by the top medical school in the country. And that's been repeated by a lot of folks, including an Australian team recently looked at a brain bank in Europe and found out of 350 brains, 0 met the criteria. This is not a common disease because only a few of us have been, put your word in there, dumb enough, big enough to get hit in the head 20,000 times in your life, right? And let's ask that just to get an idea. How many people here have been hit hard in the head last year? One person. All right, so we're not a very couple people. Yeah, it's not a common thing to get hit in the head. Temporality, so timing. Does the exposure precede the disease? So that's probably the best way to understand that right now is appreciating what we're finding with our staging. So this is a study. This is from our 2013 brain paper, but now we have 10 times as many cases. We're finding the same thing. The disease appears to be progressive in the sense that the stage 1, where they have a little bit, the average age is 28. Stage 2, where they have more, 44. Stage 3, average age 56. Stage 4, 77. So what's interesting is that all those hits are happening between basically age 5 and age 20. And then the disease is appearing and progressing. So that's one way to look at temporality. We're not finding stage 4 in 10-year-olds. We're just finding the beginnings of it. Biological gradient. This is actually where the evidence has become the strongest, and it's really interesting. So we published a study in October that has really changed the conversation in our minds and a lot of different people. So we looked at our football cases, and we tried to figure out why were the positives positives and negatives negative? What about the variables that go into exposure explained it? And so out of our first 266 deceased former amateur and pro players, 223 had CTE. Most other had other neurodegenerative diseases. The way we got them is we looked at our brain bank at that time, found the football players over age 20, and then we looked at the Framingham Heart Study brain bank. So the town of Framingham outside Boston has actually been studied for 3 generations. As well, it's a very unique study. It's called the Framingham Heart Study because we've primarily been looking at heart risk factors, and that's actually why we know high blood pressure when you're young causes problems when you're older, is because we followed them. But we're also getting their brains. And so there were 11 football players in the 222 brains. And we combined them, the ones that were over age 20, and we had 223 with, 43 without. And interestingly, all of the Framingham people were without. But what appeared to be driving whether or not they had CTE was how long they played, how many years they played. So this is CT status, if they had it, how many years they played, and if they didn't have it. And so if you look here, not many people who played more than 15 years didn't have it, which is it's not an absolute. It's not but it's close. And then the ones who did have it spread over a lot of years. And so there were people who had it who only played a few years. We also found that severity increased the more years you played. It was a very clear association, very clear graph, but just the numbers are what's most interesting to me. Your odds of having CTE went up 30% per year you played. So they probably start at near 0, even after 1 year, very near 0, but they compound very, very quickly. Your odds of having severe CT went up, doubled every 5.3 years you played, and the odds of having a greater neurofibrillary tangled burden also went up every year you played. So that's very strong findings, and in fact, the p-value on this for the scientists in the room was 0.000000038. So about a 4 in a billion shot. This trend is wrong. The more years you play, the worse off you are. This study was also delayed by a year because we were also very concerned that a brain bank can be biased in terms of the brains we get, right? Because people see the symptoms, they're more likely to donate. So we tried to understand how would bias affect those results. And so these very interesting cubes were done by our genius statisticians and neurologists, and there are people that are smarter than me, but I can explain to you what it shows. What they did was they tried to analyze, well, what does bias really mean? And so they imagined what even the most extreme bias. So let's say that people who somehow knew their loved one had CT were like 50 times more likely to donate than people who didn't have it. And I'll tell you that's a very extreme bias, because I'm the person who's called the most families, and it's never about whether or not they had the symptoms. It's just about how can they get it done before the funeral or something like that. And because you've had negative cases already. It's not about whether or not you have it. But even if you assumed the most biased case, the worst case scenario goes up 22% per year instead of 30%. But it could be going up 40% per year. So that's the range. So it's very strong findings. So that's the pathological findings. It's also, I think, interesting to see some of our clinical studies. We have this one study called the Legend Study, where we've been interviewing football players every year since about 2009. And you sign up for this study because probably you're interested in this. And so we stratified a few hundred football players based on how many years they played. And then we came up with something called the Head Impact Index. Phil Montenegro came up with this as his Ph.D. project. Basically, we've had sensors in football helmets, and we can tell you if you were a high school linebacker, you averaged 700 hits per year. If you were a college defensive tackle, you averaged 900 hits per year. We just did the math on everybody for what position they played at what age and came up with their Head Impact Index. And what we found is that in terms of self-report, because this was over phone and online testing, again, all these people were concerned enough to sign up for the study, but their rate of showing up as impaired on every test was correlated with how many hits to the head they took. So basically the idea is for something like behavioral dysregulation, those who had fewer than about 3,172 hits here had dysregulation at the rate of the population. So that's sort of baseline rate. But for every about 1,500 hits they took, that risk increased to the point where those who took almost 10,000 hits to the head, more than half were impaired. But the interesting thing is we found that for both behavioral dysregulation, as well as analyses of metacognition, as well as analyses of executive dysfunction, as well as analyses of depression and apathy and cognitive impairment. So this is a strikingly consistent finding in this population. And those who had more than 12,000 hits were 25 times more likely to report cognitive impairment than those who did not. So biological gradient was what we've been talking about. Dose-response relationship. We are seeing that as clear as day and with extraordinary results. Plausibility. So is it plausible that getting hit in the head can cause your brain to degenerate? So I'll ask you this. Can you think of something that would be similar to that we all sort of understand and realize? Anyone here had some injuries that haunt them later? Maybe arthritis? How's your knee? Right? When was the last time you were hurt? 20 years ago. Is it getting worse? Do any of us question that you hurt your knee and that we can expect to be limping in 20 or 30 years? Why? Why is that so obvious to us? But you're going to tell me that bone and that cartilage is degenerating, but your soft brain, if you hit it 20,000 times, would not? Right? So it's pretty plausible that if you hit someone in the head enough. We all understand punch drunk. No one questions punch drunk. But we're going to say, but if it's football, if it's rugby, well, I still got to see the numbers here. I don't think you need that. Coherence. So coherence between epidemiological findings and laboratory findings. That's what Dr. Buckland showed. So the lab findings are the brains. The epidemiological findings are Scottish football players, 5 times risk of Alzheimer's. NFL players, 5 times risk of Alzheimer's. That's stacking up. Experiments. Can you create this in an experiment? It turns out it appears you can. So this was published in January 2018 by our team. Concussion, microvascular injury, and early tauopathy in young athletes after impact head injury and impact concussion mouse model. So this was a really impressive group of folks. This involved scientists from, it was led by Lee Goldstein at BU, but the Cleveland Clinic, Lawrence Livermore National Labs, which are physicists, New York Medical College, the VA, folks in Israel, Canada, UK. They basically created a model that they tried to recreate head impacts for mice that like football players get. Because when you talk about mouse models and brain injury, there have been different ways we've given mice brain injuries that aren't like what football players get. So there's a lot of important science done. I'm just showing you this, say they did a lot of testing. But the real important image was this one. This is looking for that abnormal tau. They have normal tau, but the red is abnormal tau. And what they found is they hit mice on the left side of the head. They started to get this abnormal tau forming. Over 3 days and 2 weeks and 5.5 months, it's still there. But what was the interesting finding about this was on the other side of the brain where they weren't hit. You didn't see that because it was an acute process that was happening 3 days, 2 weeks, but then at 5.5 months it's there. And that's because it's spreading. And that's what we think is happening in humans as well, that spread over time. It's accelerated in mice because they have much shorter lifespans. It's not, mice don't get exactly CT, but this spreading tau is very important. So we basically were able to say, the conclusion was, we saw the same brain pathology in these acute teenagers. We had a bunch of teenage brains that had early CTE, also present in these head injured mice, and it was spreading. Now, it's important to note, and this is something that I'll talk about a couple times, it was not related to symptoms. So for mice, they looked at signs of concussion. Were they knocked out? How long were they knocked out? Did they have balance problems? No correlation between what they showed and the pathology. And that's what we keep finding over and over again now with these 800 brains. It's inappropriate to talk about CT as a concussion issue. And I would get rid of that language. We are finding no correlation between the number of times that you raised your hand and said, I can't see straight, or were knocked out to the point where they dragged you off the field. Those numbers are not real because we hide those concussions, right? So we're not, even though concussions are probably worse than those hits to the head that don't cause those symptoms, those hits to the head that cause symptoms happen 1,000 times more than the ones that do. And that's what we need to be focused on. And then, as Dr. Goldstein said, this is pretty strong causal evidence. So that's 8. And then number 9 is analogy. And we don't have great analogies for this because there's not anything else that causes this. Right? We don't have some other similar concept of getting hit in the head that's causing this. But I'll give you one analogy I think is important, and that's when we looked at that football study and found that increased odds at 30% per year, which is a curve like this, right, where you get to 15 years, 30, 40 times risk than normal people. That you can overlay that curve on smoking and lung cancer risk curves, right? Actually, if you look at the studies that look at increased odds, smoking increased odds of lung cancer go up about 25 to 33% per year. So your risk of CT in a sport like American football might go up faster. And so it's important to appreciate that this is a real issue. But that cause and effect by the most commonly cited standard has basically been met, and met in a lot of different ways, and met very powerfully. And so no one should walk out of this lecture thinking we need to wait 2 generations to figure out what's going on to take action today, because this is a problem that we need to deal with right now. And if you accept causation, it changes what you'll do going forward. You'll work harder to focus on learning the diagnosis in the living, because if we can't diagnose this in the living, we can't run real clinical trials to try to stop this, because no pharmaceutical company is going to pay for a study where they might have the wrong population, right? It could be throwing away money, and neurological studies are extraordinarily expensive. We'll focus more on counseling families to deal with this, right? Because we know, you'll hear more about this, that families really struggle with this. And we'll work on really stopping and learning what we can do to stop and slow this, because right now we don't have good answers. But most importantly, and I think the most acute thing, is we'll learn how to prevent this, right? Preventing this is not hard. Stop hitting people in the head. Stop hitting children in the head. Don't let them run into each other 1,000 times a year, right? It's not a good idea. It has consequences. And accepting this causation will mobilize folks to say, we need to change the rules of these sports. We invented the rules of these sports not knowing this was an issue. Now we know it's time to change. And the other part of that is that what are we going to learn from these studies? And so another comment that was made about the NRL study, I want to disagree with, and I don't want this idea to get out there in the population, because this is never going to happen. A quote was said, it said, the biggest thing is to be able to identify those who may be more vulnerable to CTE or long-term effects, and allow them to make informed choices about whether or not they want to allow themselves to continue to be exposed to certain risk factors. It's a nice idea, right? That, you might get a test when you're a 22-year-old NRL player, and you go, oh, I got a bad gene. I should stop playing. And the person with a good gene, they can go on and keep playing. But that's not realistic for a number of reasons. It starts with the fact that everyone starts rugby as a kid. Right? There's no such thing as informed consent when you're a child. We just have to talk about that, and we have to accept that. Right? And I think about that, and a great analogy to understand that the risks that kids are taking when they start tackling young is captured very well in this Doonesbury comic. Do you guys do Doonesbury down here? Do you have that? Great American iconic comic. But there's a character, Mr. Butts, cigarette. And one of the important things he points out when he was taking on a cigarette industry, he was sort of doing the same thing, was studies show that almost 90% of all smokers start before they're 18. I would say studies show about 100% of rugby players start before they're 18, right? And after that, kids tend to mature to make boring lifestyle choices, right? That's why the smoking industry has always been trying to hook them young, right? So how many people right now, I already asked, so 2 people have been hit in the head once in the last year, right? But how many people have kids who've been hit in the head hundreds of times, right? How many people would sign up to play tackle rugby today? Right? Well, no, this is not, once you realize the value of your body and what pain looks like, you don't do those sorts of things unless they pay you. That's why they have to pay the rugby players, right? This is not, so it's important to appreciate this is kids making the choice to do this. They're not going to get genetic counseling. And the other reason they're not going to get genetic counseling is because no profile is going to be 100% protective, right? We've proven that with the NFL cases, right? We have, a couple of negatives. They don't have magic genes. They have less exposure, right? But to appreciate why this is sort of a really odd idea of being counseled on should you play, let's put this as another analogy. Let's put it back to smoking and lung cancer. Do you guys know that there are genes that help predict whether or not you'll get lung cancer? Has your doctor ever sat you down and said, let's do a genetic test. I think you have good genes for smoking. You could get away with it. You would have a really low chance of lung cancer. No, that's never going to happen. It's never going to happen that your doctor's going to do that. And it's never going to happen that a doctor's going to sit you down and say, go bash your head 1,000 times. You might be fine. Okay? And I part of the reason I want to talk about that right now is because that concept of it's genetic risk that's causing this and not that it's exposure that's causing this is part of an overall push that's a bit of a blame the victim issue, right? It changes the focus from it's the hits to the head to he had bad genes, he had bad risk factors, but if he knew, he wouldn't have done it, right? That's not reality, all right? And so when I talk about genes being an issue, I also then want to say, also beware when I start talking about lifestyle factors, right? You often will hear, this happens in the NFL, and it happens a lot in America, and I don't know how much it happens here, but professional sports league affiliated doctors raise, well, they were alcohol abusers, they took drugs, they took opiates, and that's what caused their problems. That's what caused that CTE. There's no evidence to support that that's causing the tau pathology, right? That's zero. So every time that's raised, call them out. Show me the evidence. Otherwise, stop playing this blame the victim culture, right? These people signed up for the sport, trusting who their coaches in the leagues. We have published on genes, though, so it is important to realize there are genetic risk factors. But we're finding out, and this is one small study, but we finally have the number of cases to do this. It's really not about genetic. It's not about risk factors. It's risk modifiers. What we found with this TMEM 106B is that not that they were more likely to get CT, they were more likely to get worse CT if they got CT. What was driving their risk of CT is still how many years they played, how many hits to the head they took, right? And years of play is just a corollary for hits to the head they took. But it didn't make them more likely to actually develop it. And this is just an illustration of what that looks like. If you had 2 of these genes, you were worse, 1, 0, right? And then give one more analogy to that idea of being counseled. We've also published that cognitive reserve is protective against the symptoms of CT. That's not a surprise. It's well known in Alzheimer's disease. Higher intelligence, higher educational attainment, higher occupational status makes more likely the symptoms will be later, even with the same pathology, because your brain can work around it. So if you think about that analogy back to counseling players, if it's not genes, you can imagine them doing an IQ test and saying, oh, you've got a pretty high IQ. You could probably lose a few brain cells. You should play rugby, right? Like, it's not the way this is going to work. So with all that, I want to show you a PSA we put together that coincided with the release of the study showing your risk goes up 30% per year. Because when you stretch that out, That means you play nine extra years of American football, your risk is 10 times more than someone who didn't, right? And so you start at 5 instead of age 14, and I still thank my mother for holding me out till 14 until I played American football. But if I started at 5, I'd have 10 times the risk of CTE, having played the same number of years after 14. And so we made a PSA to try to drive this point home to parents that this is probably a bad idea. It created a lot of controversy. You'll see why. What do you think? It went viral, yeah. Well, the thing is, we have the evidence in American football, and I would say we need to build the evidence in other sports to do something that aggressive. But we can talk. But yeah, Fox News had 3 10-minute debates on that for 3 straight days. Thank you, Rupert Murdoch. So I know I'm basically over time, so I'm going to quickly go through these last 2 points, which is responsible reporting on CT. So one of the important things is we've been focused, and I've been focused on prevention, right? Let's get people to realize that they don't have to do this to their kids. But in talking about the horrors of CT, we also need to recognize that there's a lot of us, and I'm part of that club, who need to think or are thinking about, could this be me? And so I want to just quickly walk through how we can better talk about this. So we have proposed clinical subtypes of CT and how do you diagnose as living people. This is a early version that's already being revised of research concepts. But part of the idea is that you don't have CTE unless you're getting hit in the head a lot, right? 1 concussion, 1 slip and fall, don't worry about that. The criteria says, a long history of being hit, and we're not talking about years, like a minimum of 4 years before you even think about it. No other disorder that could be causing it, because lots of disorders can cause things that look like CTE. Clinical features will be present for a minimum of 12 months, meaning, you can have bad things and get better. At least 1 core clinical feature, which I'll show, a change from baseline functioning, at least 2 supportive features. So this is not actually accurate, so don't go to this. It's already been revised. It'll be published. But core features, cognitive decline, behavioral, and mood symptoms. Cognitive decline is proving to be the most consistent. If you have a persistent cognitive decline that stays, that's more likely to be CT or some other neurodegenerative disease. Mood and behavior can be caused by a lot of other things. They're not very specific to CTE. Supportive things we see: impulsivity, anxiety, apathy, paranoia, suicidality, headache, motor signs. These are all sort of rare, though, right? Like CT is a very heterogeneous disease, causes different problems in different people. The vast majority of news coverage on CT, I think, has been incredibly positive, incredibly forthright, incredibly honest. But now that as we're doing that, let's also, as this awareness grows, let's think about the athletes who are concerned about this. So I'm going to go through some common misunderstandings. It's inaccurate to believe if you had a concussion or 2, you're automatically at risk for CTE. What would be accurate to say is CT is associated with repetitive impacts over years, and that most of the people diagnosed were contact or collision sport athletes. There's no correlation with concussions, as I've mentioned. Few, if any, cases of CTE exist in people never exposed to these thousands of head impacts. And even 20% of our cases never had a diagnosed concussion. So, and that's because they hid them. They probably had them, but again, it's not the driving factor. It's inaccurate to believe that every person with CT develops suicide. Those get the headlines because they're shocking and they're often sad and they're young and they're prime of their lives, so they're interesting. Many people's CTE, as exhibited by Dr. Buckley's most recent case, can live long, happy lives even while they have the disease. So it's important to remind people that we have lots of cases of people who had very productive lives into their 70s or 80s. Most people do not die by suicide. There are people who do. The most common cause of death in our young cases is suicide, but that's because young people don't die from from other things. It's the 2nd or 3rd leading cause of death in those age groups. So the reason we get them in the brain bank is because those people want answers, right? Who doesn't? So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening for everybody. And when we report on it, it's important not to sensationalize it, not offer CT as a sole cause, although I do believe it's contributing in many of these cases. And follow the guidelines. There's actually guidelines on reporting on suicide.org that we follow and train our team on. That being said, there have been studies showing that even the earliest bits disease in Alzheimer's does cause psychiatric symptoms. Rock stage 1 will cause increased agitation, anxiety, apathy, depression, sleep problems. This was not known until last year. This was published last year. We always thought Alzheimer's is just cognition, but early stage also causes increased psychiatric symptoms. I have no doubt that CT does the same. We just have to prove it. If you have CT symptoms earlier in midlife, it's guaranteed to progress to dementia. Not accurate, right? Lots of people, it appears to be progressive in most people, but clearly not progressive in all people. That's why we get 76-year-olds with stage 2, right? And it may not spread the same speed throughout life. We don't know what's affecting that. And symptom plateaus are very common, right? So don't think just because you've had a dip that that's going to keep going. You might be fine and stay where you are for a long time. We can't, and what is inaccurate is say we cannot diagnose and cannot treat CTE. You can treat CT symptoms, right? We don't have a way to stop the disease, but you can feel better if you're worried about this. So go see a doctor, and that's why I'm so glad the Brain Bank is offering referrals now and getting its clinical research program up, right? And then, CT is the pathology. We're starting to use the term TES to talk about the clinical syndrome, and clinicians are now getting comfortable saying you have possible CT or probable CT, just like Alzheimer's disease. We sometimes fail to realize Alzheimer's disease also can't be diagnosed until death, right? When the clinician tells you they think you have it, they're talking about they're about 80% accurate. But they know that because they have published criteria that have been tested for that. We don't have that published criteria and haven't run those tests. But clinical judgment can substitute for that. So we can talk about maybe having it. And then all that said, I don't think we should sugarcoat CTE, right? It is horrible for a lot of people. And then we have to accept that, and we have to talk about that because this is important for prevention. Our families encourage us to share their stories. You can see by who's here today, those families are sharing their stories. It affects people through violence, addiction, bankruptcy, divorce. A lot of things go on. So especially because it's preventable, it's important we talk about those things. So then finally, to wrap up and offer hope, again, we're going to start talking more about this over the next year, but CT is not destiny. There's actually been research now shown on NFL players, that not every, we know this from our experience, but not every athlete with CT has the same experience. Outcomes may be modified by cardiovascular health. I think we're about to show you that. So exercise and diet are absolutely critical. I want to be Peter Fitzsimons and a national crew champion and get into my rowing and be fit, because that is what will help you. And what we just published is tau is not the only thing that's causing problems in the brain. With brain injury also comes white matter damage, and white matter changes that are different than everybody. And so you could have little tau, a lot of white matter, a lot of tau, and little white matter damage. But also arterial sclerosis influences dementia, right? So vascular dementia is a very common cause of dementia. So head injuries causes blood vessel damage. And if you also add on being heavy, not exercising, you will have more blood vessel damage, and that will cause more brain damage. And so you don't want to add on to what you're already doing. So fitness really, really matters. And then we're also finding sleep really matters, right? You're not getting sleep, you're going to have bad cognition anyway. You fix your sleep. We've had a lot of people pulled out of, I've got CTE in my 40s to, oh my God, I'm now got a CPAP machine, I have sleep apnea, I can sleep again and I feel better, right? So definitely dig in on sleep, because sleep is also important for keeping brain health. Pain management we're finding is very important, right? So with injuries, and hits the head comes other injuries, and if you don't manage that pain, it can spiral into other things, including addiction. And then finances and family are an important variable, right? Those who can keep their family together because they don't develop those symptoms that make their families leave them have much better outcomes. Finances matter. Keeping an eye on finances. Sometimes people start making irrational business decisions, so keeping an eye on that is also important to make sure you're protected. But I'm sorry I went over. I just got on a roll. Sort of happens. But I want to thank you guys for doing this, because, again, we started this Gold Brain Bank 18 months ago with Dr. Buckland and the Australian Sports Brain Bank, thanks to the introduction from Dr. Cohen, who found him, was a talent scout. And we're going to be starting new collaborations, announcing a few over the next few months, because we need all the folks we can get working on this. And I hope you can use this knowledge to protect the folks you're working with. Brazil is another place. They're doing some amazing work. Don't have time to talk about it. So I want to say thanks to everybody who's making this work happen. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry I went over.